Marcus stared at the gym equipment through the frosted glass door, his breath forming small clouds in the December morning air. For 3 months, he had paid the membership fee religiously while walking past this same entrance every day on his way to work. Today felt different, though he couldn't articulate why. The familiar voice in his head began its daily sermon. You're tired from yesterday's late meeting. Your shoulder still aches. You'll go tomorrow when you're more prepared. But something had shifted in Marcus during the sleepless hours of the previous night. He had discovered what warriors throughout history had known but rarely spoke about: the mental override system that bypasses the brain's default resistance mechanisms and forces the body into action regardless of emotional state or circumstance. The human mind operates on multiple levels simultaneously, creating a complex hierarchy of decision-making processes that most people never consciously examine. At the surface level lies the emotional mind, reactive, immediate, and heavily influenced by comfort-seeking behaviors. This is the voice that whispers excuses, rationalizes inaction, and constructs elaborate justifications for maintaining the status quo. Below this surface chatter exists what neuroscientists have termed the executive function network, a collection of brain regions responsible for planning, decision-making, and impulse control. Marcus had spent years allowing his emotional mind to dictate his actions, believing that motivation was a prerequisite for achievement. He waited for inspiration to strike, for circumstances to align perfectly, for the right mood to emerge. This approach had led him through a series of abandoned projects, broken promises to himself, and a growing sense that he was somehow fundamentally different from those who seemed to accomplish their goals with apparent ease. The revelation came during a particularly low moment when Marcus was scrolling through social media, comparing his lack of progress to the carefully curated success stories of others. Instead of falling deeper into self-pity, he realized that he had been operating under a fundamental misunderstanding about the nature of human action. He had believed that successful people were simply more motivated, more inspired, or somehow naturally inclined toward discipline. The truth was far more mechanical and, paradoxically, more hopeful. The mental override system functions independently of motivation, emotion, or circumstance. It operates on the principle that the human body is designed to respond to clear, non-negotiable commands when they are delivered with sufficient conviction and specificity. This system bypasses the emotional evaluation process entirely, treating decisions not as preferences to be weighed but as programming instructions to be executed. Understanding this system requires examining the difference between decision-making and decision-executing. Most people conflate these two distinct processes, assuming that the quality of their decisions determines the quality of their outcomes. In reality, the most perfectly crafted decision becomes worthless without a reliable execution mechanism. The mental override system serves as this mechanism, creating a direct pathway from intention to action that circumvents the emotional mind's tendency to reconsider, rationalize, and ultimately abandon commitments made during moments of clarity. The architecture of mental override rests on 3 foundational principles that operate in sequence. First, the establishment of non-negotiable parameters that remove decision-making from the moment of action. Second, the cultivation of identity-based commands that leverage the brain's powerful drive for internal consistency. Third, the implementation of mechanical execution protocols that treat actions as automatic responses to predetermined triggers rather than choices to be evaluated in real time. Marcus began experimenting with these principles immediately, starting with the simple act of entering the gym. Instead of relying on motivation or trying to generate enthusiasm for exercise, he established a non-negotiable parameter. When the clock shows 6 a.m., my body moves toward the gym entrance. This wasn't a goal or intention. It was a programming instruction that his mind would execute regardless of how he felt about it in the moment. The first few days of implementing this mental override felt strange and somewhat robotic. Marcus found himself walking to the gym while simultaneously experiencing resistance, doubt, and a complete lack of enthusiasm for the upcoming workout. The emotional mind continued its protests, but these protests no longer had the power to influence his actions. His body moved according to the predetermined instruction while his emotions gradually adapted to this new reality. This adaptation process revealed another crucial aspect of the mental override system: the emotional mind's remarkable ability to align itself with consistent behavior patterns. When actions become non-negotiable, the emotional mind stops wasting energy on resistance and begins generating supporting narratives instead. Within 2 weeks, Marcus noticed that his internal dialogue had shifted from "I don't want to work out" to "This is what I do at 6 a.m." The power of identity-based commands became evident as Marcus's self-concept began evolving in response to his consistent actions. Instead of seeing himself as someone who struggled with fitness, he began identifying as someone who goes to the gym every morning. This identity shift created a positive feedback loop where his actions reinforced his self-concept, which in turn made future actions feel more natural and inevitable. The mechanical execution protocols eliminated the daily decision fatigue that had previously sabotaged his efforts. By treating gym attendance as an automatic response to the 6 a.m. trigger, Marcus removed the cognitive load associated with choosing whether or not to exercise. The decision had been made once, at a meta level, and didn't require daily reconsideration. As Marcus's experiment with mental override expanded beyond fitness, he began recognizing patterns in how successful individuals across various domains seemed to operate. Professional athletes didn't rely on feeling motivated to train. They followed predetermined schedules regardless of their emotional state. Successful entrepreneurs didn't wait for inspiration to strike before working on their businesses. They maintained consistent daily practices that moved their ventures forward incrementally but reliably. The mental override system explained why some people appeared to have supernatural discipline, while others struggled with basic consistency. Those who seemed naturally disciplined had either consciously or unconsciously developed the ability to bypass their emotional evaluation systems and execute predetermined behaviors regardless of circumstance. They had discovered that motivation is a luxury rather than a necessity, and that waiting for the right emotional state is a reliable path to inaction and regret. Marcus's growing mastery of mental override began attracting attention from colleagues and friends, who noticed his increased productivity and consistent behavior patterns. When asked about his transformation, he struggled to explain the concept in terms that didn't sound overly mechanical or dismissive of the role of emotions in human life. The truth was that mental override didn't eliminate emotions. It simply prevented them from having veto power over important actions. The system proved particularly powerful in areas where Marcus had previously struggled with procrastination and avoidance. Writing projects that had languished for months suddenly moved forward when he established non-negotiable daily writing sessions. Financial planning, which he had avoided due to anxiety about his current situation, became manageable when he programmed himself to spend 15 minutes each evening, updating his budget and reviewing his accounts. The cumulative effect of multiple mental override protocols created a sense of momentum that transcended any single area of improvement. Marcus discovered that consistency in one domain seemed to strengthen his ability to maintain consistency in others, as if the mental muscles required for override were transferable across different types of challenges. This realization led him to one of the most profound insights of his journey. The version of himself that had spent years making excuses and avoiding difficult tasks was not his true self. It was a weak, reactive version that had been allowed to dominate through lack of conscious direction. The mental override system wasn't changing who he was. It was allowing his stronger, more capable self to emerge by systematically dismantling the defense mechanisms that had kept that stronger self suppressed. The man Marcus was becoming through the application of mental override principles bore little resemblance to the man he had been 6 months earlier. Where once there had been uncertainty and self-doubt, there was now a quiet confidence born from the knowledge that he could rely on himself to follow through on commitments. Where once there had been elaborate internal negotiations about simple tasks, there was now smooth execution of predetermined protocols. But this transformation came with its own set of challenges and revelations that would test the true limits of the mental override system. As Marcus's external circumstances began changing in response to his newfound consistency, he encountered resistance from unexpected sources and discovered that destroying one's weak self inevitably creates ripple effects that extend far beyond personal behavior modification. The architecture of mental override, while powerful in its simplicity, required constant refinement and adaptation as new challenges emerged. Marcus was about to discover that the system's greatest test would not come from his own internal resistance, but from the external world's reaction to his transformation and the choices he would need to make about which version of himself he was truly committed to becoming. Part 2. The systematic destruction of the weak self. The first sign that Marcus's transformation was creating larger disruptions came during a team meeting at his marketing firm. For years, he had been the reliable yes man who took on extra projects, stayed late to compensate for others' mistakes, and absorbed criticism without pushing back. His colleagues had grown comfortable with this version of Marcus, predictable, accommodating, and unlikely to challenge the status quo. But the mental override system that had revolutionized his personal habits was beginning to influence his professional behavior in ways he hadn't anticipated. When his manager casually assigned him a Friday afternoon project that would require weekend work, Marcus found himself responding with unprecedented clarity. "I won't be available this weekend. If this project is truly urgent, we need to discuss timeline and resource allocation now, or schedule it for next week." The silence that followed his response revealed something profound about the social systems that had been unconsciously supporting his weak self. His colleagues weren't just accustomed to the old Marcus. They were actively invested in maintaining that version of him. The weak self served functions for others that the stronger self would not. This realization forced Marcus to confront an uncomfortable truth about personal transformation. Destroying the weak self inevitably threatens the comfort and convenience of those who have benefited from its compliance and predictability. The mental override system had given him the tools to act independently of his emotional state, but it also revealed how many of his previous emotional states had been unconsciously shaped by others' expectations and manipulations. The weak self, Marcus began to understand, was not simply a collection of bad habits or character flaws. It was an entire identity structure that had been carefully constructed through years of social conditioning, fear-based decision-making, and the path of least resistance. This weak self had its own internal logic, its own survival mechanisms, and its own network of relationships and circumstances that supported its continued existence. Destroying this weak self required more than changing behaviors. It demanded a systematic dismantling of the beliefs, relationships, and environmental factors that had created and maintained it. Marcus discovered that every aspect of his weak self was interconnected, and attempting to change one element without addressing the others created internal tension and external resistance that could easily derail his progress. The process began with identifying the core beliefs that had given the weak self its power. These beliefs operated largely below conscious awareness, functioning as invisible rules that determined what Marcus considered possible, appropriate, or realistic for someone like him. "I'm not the type of person who," had been the prefix to countless self-limiting statements that had shaped his choices for decades. Using the same mental override principles that had transformed his daily routines, Marcus began systematically challenging and replacing these foundational beliefs. Instead of waiting for evidence that he was capable of leadership before attempting to lead, he began acting as a leader and allowing his self-concept to adjust to this new reality. Instead of believing he was naturally disorganized and therefore incapable of maintaining systems, he implemented organizational protocols and watched his identity shift to accommodate his new capabilities. This belief transformation process revealed the weak self's most insidious characteristic, its ability to interpret any evidence through a lens that confirmed its own limitations. When Marcus succeeded at something, the weak self would attribute it to luck, timing, or external factors. When he failed, the weak self would use it as proof of inherent inadequacy and reason to avoid similar challenges in the future. The mental override system disrupted this interpretive pattern by creating a track record of consistent action that became increasingly difficult for the weak self to explain away or minimize. When Marcus maintained his workout routine for 3 months straight, the weak self could no longer credibly claim that he lacked discipline. When he consistently delivered high-quality work while maintaining clear boundaries about his availability, the weak self could no longer argue that professional success required sacrificing personal standards. But the weak self didn't surrender its territory without a fight. As Marcus's new behaviors created positive outcomes, the weak self employed increasingly sophisticated forms of resistance. It began generating anxiety about the sustainability of his changes, whispering that he was pushing too hard and would inevitably burn out. It created elaborate scenarios about potential negative consequences of his newfound assertiveness, warning him that he was alienating people and damaging relationships. Most insidiously, the weak self began attempting to co-opt his progress by taking credit for the changes while simultaneously arguing that they weren't real or significant. This internal voice would say things like, "See, I always knew you had it in you. But don't get too confident because this is probably just a phase." Recognizing these resistance patterns allowed Marcus to develop counter-protocols specifically designed to neutralize the weak self's influence. Instead of engaging with the weak self's arguments or attempting to refute its claims, he began treating its voice as background noise, acknowledging its presence without allowing it to influence his actions or decisions. This approach proved particularly powerful because it avoided the trap of internal conflict that had previously consumed so much of his mental energy. Rather than fighting the weak self, Marcus simply made it irrelevant by consistently acting from his stronger self regardless of what the weak self had to say about it. The systematic destruction of the weak self accelerated as Marcus began making more significant changes that created irreversible momentum. He left his comfortable but unfulfilling job to start a consulting practice focused on helping other professionals implement systematic approaches to personal and professional development. This decision created external circumstances that made returning to his weak self practically impossible. He now had clients who were counting on him to embody the principles he taught. The financial pressure and responsibility of running his own business eliminated many of the safety nets that had previously enabled weak self-behaviors. He could no longer afford to procrastinate on important projects, avoid difficult conversations, or wait for motivation to strike before taking action. The external environment now required consistent strength and reliability, creating a positive feedback loop that reinforced his mental override protocols. As his business grew, Marcus attracted clients who were struggling with similar patterns of self-sabotage and inconsistency. Working with these individuals deepened his understanding of how the weak self operates and revealed universal patterns that transcended individual personality types and circumstances. He noticed that virtually everyone who sought his help had constructed elaborate justification systems that explained why their current situation was reasonable, temporary, or the result of factors beyond their control. These justification systems served as the weak self's primary defense mechanism, creating intellectual frameworks that made inaction seem rational and change seem unnecessary or impossible. The process of helping clients dismantle their own justification systems forced Marcus to examine the remnants of his own weak self that were still operating in subtle ways. He discovered that the weak self was remarkably adaptive, capable of surviving even systematic attempts at destruction by finding new forms of expression that were harder to detect and eliminate. For example, Marcus's weak self had adapted to his new productivity habits by shifting from overt procrastination to more sophisticated forms of resistance. Instead of avoiding work entirely, it would direct his attention toward less important but easier tasks, creating a sense of productivity while avoiding the most challenging and impactful activities. Instead of making obvious excuses for poor performance, it would set perfectionistic standards that made completion impossible and provided built-in justifications for delay and revision. Recognizing these evolved forms of weak self-behavior required developing increasingly sophisticated detection and override protocols. Marcus learned to distinguish between genuine productivity and busy work, between healthy high standards and perfectionistic avoidance, between reasonable caution and fear-based inaction. The most profound revelation came when Marcus realized that the weak self's ultimate survival strategy was to convince him that its complete destruction was either impossible or undesirable. It would argue that some amount of weakness, doubt, and accommodation was necessary for maintaining relationships, avoiding arrogance, and staying connected to his humanity. This argument was particularly seductive because it contained elements of truth. Complete elimination of all forms of vulnerability, uncertainty, and flexibility would indeed create problems. But Marcus discovered that there was a crucial difference between the conscious strategic application of these qualities and their unconscious reactive expression through the weak self. A strong person can choose to be vulnerable in appropriate circumstances as a tool for connection and growth. A weak person is vulnerable by default and has no choice in the matter. A strong person can acknowledge uncertainty while still taking decisive action based on available information. A weak person uses uncertainty as an excuse for indefinite inaction. The systematic destruction of the weak self was not about eliminating all traces of humanity or becoming a mechanical optimization machine. It was about eliminating the unconscious reactive patterns that prevented conscious choice and deliberate action. It was about ensuring that when Marcus chose to be accommodating, vulnerable, or uncertain, these choices came from strength rather than weakness. As this distinction became clearer, Marcus's approach to weak self-destruction became more precise and targeted. He began focusing specifically on the elimination of unconscious reactive patterns while preserving and even cultivating the conscious application of qualities that might superficially resemble weakness, but actually represented sophisticated forms of strength. This refinement process revealed that the strongest version of himself was not the opposite of his weak self, but rather a completely different operating system that made the weak self's concerns and methods irrelevant. The weak self operated from scarcity, fear, and external validation. The strong self operated from abundance, courage, and internal validation. The transition between these operating systems was not gradual or partial. It was a complete replacement that fundamentally altered how Marcus processed information, made decisions, and interacted with the world. The man who emerged from this systematic destruction bore so little resemblance to his former weak self that observers who had known him for years began treating him as if he were an entirely different person. This external recognition of his transformation created the final test of his commitment to destroying the weak self. The temptation to revert to familiar patterns when faced with social pressure, unexpected challenges, or the simple human desire to be liked and accepted by others who were more comfortable with his previous version. Part 3. The Indestructible Man. The phone call came at 2:17 a.m. on a Tuesday in March, 8 months after Marcus had begun his systematic transformation. His former manager's voice was slurred with alcohol and desperation. "Marcus, I need you back. The Johnson account is falling apart and nobody else can handle it like you used to. I'll double your salary, give you the promotion I should have given you years ago. Just come back and fix this mess." 6 months earlier, this call would have triggered a cascade of familiar responses. The weak self would have interpreted the crisis as validation that he was needed, irreplaceable, and valued. It would have generated guilt about abandoning his former colleagues and anxiety about their ability to succeed without his intervention. Most powerfully, it would have whispered that his new path was selfish, unsustainable, and ultimately less important than being the reliable person others could count on in emergencies. But as Marcus listened to his former manager's increasingly frantic pleas, he felt something that would have been impossible during his weak self era: complete emotional detachment from the outcome. The mental override system had evolved beyond simple behavior modification into something far more profound: a fundamental rewiring of his relationship with other people's problems, expectations, and emotional states. "I appreciate the offer," Marcus replied calmly, "but I'm not available. I'd be happy to recommend some excellent consultants who could help you with the Johnson account." The conversation ended 2 minutes later, and Marcus returned to sleep without a trace of guilt, anxiety, or second-guessing. This interaction revealed the ultimate test of weak self-destruction: the ability to remain unmoved by others' attempts to resurrect the previous version of himself through appeals to guilt, obligation, and fear. The weak self had been inextricably connected to other people's needs, emotions, and expectations. Its identity had been largely defined by its usefulness to others and its ability to avoid conflict, disappointment, and disapproval. The strong self that had emerged operated from an entirely different foundation. Its identity was internally generated and maintained through consistent action aligned with predetermined values and goals. It could observe others' emotional states without automatically taking responsibility for them. It could recognize genuine emergencies requiring assistance while remaining immune to manufactured crises designed to manipulate behavior. This shift represented more than personal growth. It was a fundamental change in how Marcus related to power dynamics, social systems, and the invisible contracts that govern human relationships. The weak self had been a participant in numerous unspoken agreements where Marcus provided reliability, accommodation, and emotional labor in exchange for acceptance, security, and the illusion of being needed. Breaking these agreements required more than changing his behavior. It demanded a willingness to accept the social consequences of refusing to play roles that others had come to depend on. Some relationships couldn't survive this transition. Friends who had grown accustomed to Marcus as a free therapist, colleagues who had relied on his willingness to absorb extra work, and family members who had counted on his automatic compliance with their requests, found themselves needing to develop new strategies for getting their needs met. The initial period of social adjustment was challenging, but it revealed something profound about the nature of authentic relationships versus transactional ones. The people who remained in Marcus's life after his transformation were those who valued him for who he was rather than what he provided. These relationships deepened and became more satisfying as they were freed from the hidden resentments and power imbalances that had characterized his weak self interactions. Meanwhile, his business continued expanding as more clients were drawn to the results he was producing for others. The systematic approach to personal transformation that had emerged from his own experience was generating remarkable outcomes for individuals across various industries and life circumstances. Marcus had inadvertently discovered that the mental override principles were universally applicable, regardless of specific goals or starting points. But success brought its own challenges and temptations that tested different aspects of his transformation. As his income increased and his reputation grew, new versions of the weak self began attempting to reassert themselves. Instead of the approval-seeking and conflict-avoidant patterns of his past, he now faced the potential corruptions of success: arrogance, complacency, and the belief that his achievements made him fundamentally different from others who were still struggling. The mental override system proved equally effective at preventing these ego-based distortions as it had been at eliminating fear-based limitations. Marcus maintained the same systematic approach to self-examination and course correction that had guided his initial transformation, refusing to allow success to create blind spots or excuse lapses in the standards he had established for himself. This vigilance was tested when a major corporation offered to acquire his consulting practice for an amount that would provide financial security for life. The offer came with the condition that he would remain as an employee for 5 years, implementing his methods within their existing corporate structure under their brand and management. The weak self would have seen this offer as validation and security, an opportunity to reduce risk and gain the approval of powerful institutions. But the strong self recognized it as a potential trap that would gradually erode the autonomy and authenticity that had made his work effective. The corporate environment would inevitably require compromises that would weaken his methods and dilute his impact, in exchange for broader reach and financial rewards. Marcus declined the offer without hesitation, choosing to maintain control over his work, even if it meant accepting greater uncertainty and responsibility. This decision reinforced a crucial principle he had discovered. The strong self makes choices based on alignment with core values rather than optimization for external rewards or security. As his second year of business concluded, Marcus began recognizing patterns in how his most successful clients were applying the mental override principles in their own lives. The individuals who achieved the most dramatic and lasting transformations shared certain characteristics that distinguished them from those who made temporary improvements before reverting to previous patterns. The successful transformers possessed what Marcus came to think of as indestructibility, a quality that went beyond simple resilience or persistence. They had systematically eliminated the internal vulnerabilities that had previously allowed external circumstances, other people's opinions, and temporary setbacks to derail their progress or compromise their standards. This indestructibility was not about becoming invulnerable to all forms of damage or challenge. Rather, it was about developing immunity to the specific types of psychological and social pressures that had historically caused them to abandon their goals, betray their values, or revert to weak self-behaviors under stress. Marcus identified 5 key components of this indestructible state that consistently appeared in his most successful clients. First, complete ownership of outcomes without attachment to external validation. These individuals took full responsibility for their results while remaining emotionally independent of others' approval or disapproval of their methods or achievements. Second, systematic elimination of dependence on favorable circumstances. They had developed the ability to maintain their standards and continue their progress regardless of external conditions, other people's cooperation, or the presence or absence of motivation and inspiration. They could recognize attempts to guilt, shame, or frighten them into abandoning their commitments, without being emotionally affected by these attempts. Fourth, automatic recovery from setbacks without loss of momentum or confidence. When temporary failures or mistakes occurred, they treated them as data points to be incorporated into their systems rather than evidence of fundamental inadequacy or reason to question their path. Fifth, the ability to inspire or intimidate others through consistent demonstration of their principles rather than through argument, persuasion, or force. Their mere presence and example created pressure for others to either rise to their level or avoid interaction entirely. Marcus recognized these qualities in himself and understood that they represented the ultimate expression of weak self-destruction. The man who possessed these characteristics could not be destroyed by others because he had already destroyed everything within himself that others might target, manipulate, or exploit. This realization led to the final evolution of his mental override system. Instead of simply bypassing emotional and social pressures to maintain consistent behavior, the system had evolved to eliminate the internal structures that made him susceptible to these pressures in the first place. The indestructible man was not someone who fought against temptation, manipulation, and weakness. He was someone for whom these forces had become irrelevant because the internal mechanisms they targeted no longer existed. He didn't need to resist the temptation to procrastinate because the part of him that found procrastination appealing had been systematically eliminated. He didn't need to defend against manipulation because the insecurities and dependencies that manipulation exploits were no longer present. As Marcus reflected on his transformation during a quiet evening in his home office, surrounded by testimonials from clients whose lives had been fundamentally altered by applying these principles, he understood that he had accomplished something far more significant than personal improvement. He had discovered and documented a reliable method for any individual to destroy their weak self and become indestructible to the social, psychological, and circumstantial forces that keep most people trapped in patterns of mediocrity and compromise. The man who destroys his weak self can never be destroyed by others because there is nothing left within him for others to destroy. The mechanisms that once responded to guilt, shame, fear, and social pressure have been replaced by systems that operate from internal direction and values-based decision-making. The vulnerabilities that once made him susceptible to manipulation and control have been eliminated through systematic self-development and conscious choice. This was not a theoretical concept or philosophical ideal. It was a practical reality that Marcus lived every day and helped others achieve through the systematic application of mental override principles. The weak self could be destroyed, the strong self could be constructed, and the indestructible man could emerge from this process to live according to his own standards, regardless of external circumstances or opposition. The document of his transformation was complete, but the transformation itself was ongoing. Each day presented new opportunities to apply and refine the mental override system, to help others discover their own path to indestructibility, and to demonstrate through consistent action that the man who destroys his weak self truly cannot be destroyed by others. The architecture was proven, the systematic destruction was documented, and the indestructible man had emerged. What remained was the daily application of these principles and the gradual recognition that this transformation was not an end state to be achieved, but a way of being to be continuously embodied and expressed through every choice, action, and response to the challenges that life inevitably presents. In destroying his weak self, Marcus had not lost his humanity. He had reclaimed it from the social conditioning and fear-based patterns that had been masquerading as authentic self-expression. The indestructible man was not less human than his weak predecessor. He was more fully human because he was free to make choices based on conscious values, rather than unconscious reactions to external pressures and internal insecurities. The mental override system that had begun as a simple method for forcing action when motivation failed had evolved into a comprehensive framework for human transformation that addressed the deepest levels of identity, belief, and social conditioning. It offered a path from weakness to strength, from reactivity to choice, from external validation to internal direction, and ultimately from destructibility to indestructibility. The man who had once stood paralyzed outside a gym, unable to overcome his own resistance to simple self-improvement, had become someone who could not be moved from his chosen path by any external force or internal doubt. The transformation was complete, documented, and available to anyone willing to systematically destroy their weak self and build the indestructible person they were meant to become.